Welcome to Politics Plus Media 101, the podcast co-founded and co-hosted by John Gunnison and myself, Justin Higgins. As a reminder, we publish episodes every Tuesday and Thursday, and we take a nonpartisan, deep dive look into U.S. policy and politics, along with the most pressing foreign policy issues facing our world today. We regularly host these shows with members of Congress, members of the media, along with members of U.S. and international think tanks. If you enjoy what you are listening to, please consider subscribing to our show on whatever platform you use, along with telling your friends and family about us. On today's show, we welcome Ken Moriyasu of Nikkei Asia to discuss the impact and legacy of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Ken, I'd like to start off with a question that I've been wondering for a long time now. In reports, I've seen the former Prime Minister's name of Japan listed off as Shinzo Abe and Abe Shinzo. Can you tell me which way is correct and why we're seeing the difference?
Well, so in Japanese, we say the surname first. So I would be Moriyasu Ken in my company. And in all the interviews I do in Japan, I introduce myself as Moriyasu Ken, if they ask my full name. But since the Meiji era, when Japan opened up to the West after 300 years of being closed off, Japan made a very strong effort to internationalize. So we put the surname back and the first name front. So everybody tried to be Ken Moriyasu. More recently, the conservative element of Japan has tried to put the surname first, so that we demand the international community to respect our tradition. That is the way the Chinese pronounce their name. So they say Mao Zedong, Mao the surname first, rather than Zedong Mao. But the Chinese have always maintained their culture. Japan has tried to be more Western. So I personally don't like putting the surname first, because I think it's bringing Japan back to the Chinese sphere of influence. And Japan has been trying to move out of it and to the Western world for 200 years, but it's kind of moving back to the Chinese side. And I don't think many Japanese people realize it. So that's a long answer to your question.
Ken, before we get into the legacy and impact of the former Prime Minister Abe, do we know any more information about the assassination, whether it be about the assassin, his motives, and what ultimately led him to create such a violent and heinous act?
Yes, we are getting to know more and more of the reason why this 40-year-old man decided to kill Abe. And he has stated very clearly that his aim was to attack and kill Shinzo Abe. And he says it's because he says it's nothing to do with Shinzo Abe's political stance or his conservative tendencies or his tendency to try to bring Japan to a more militaristic state. He said it's nothing to do with that. It's more to do with his own personal family's economic status. And he is saying that his mother was a devout believer in the Unification Church, and that she was so committed to the church that she donated all the family's assets. She sold their house, she sold their property, she sold a relative's property without their consent and gave it all to the Unification Church. And that caused the family to go into bankruptcy. This man has told police that he one time considered committing suicide so that the insurance company would pay the family some money, and with that money, his sisters and brothers can go to school. So he was very desperate, and he saw on the social media that Shinzo Abe had given a speech through video link to the Unification Church. And based on that speech, some anti-Abe elements had been saying that Abe is controlled by the Unification Church, or Abe is secretly the biggest supporter of the Unification Church. So this guy believed that internet chatter and decided that I'm going to kill Abe and take revenge for my family's miserable state.
So, Ken, for those of us in the United States, we might not know very much about the Unification Church and how it fits into all of this. It's not a denomination that's very popularly discussed on our side of the Pacific Ocean over here. So could you give us a little bit more context for what we need to know about the Unification Church and how it fits into the situation so that we can better understand it?
Right. It was started by a South Korean minister. It's not one of the mainstream Christian churches in Japan. It is known for its group weddings. The founder of the church is famous for arranged marriages. So he would recommend these women to marry these men. They're all believers, and they would all one day come together, meet, and then they would marry that same day because they have so much trust in the founder, the minister, the pastor. It was always seen as like a fringe and a kind of a cult church.
So, Ken, I'd like to get a little bit more into what drove this political extremism here. In the United States, we see extremism driven largely by weird corners of the internet. Just look at, for example, the QAnon conspiracy and other conspiracies that start on the internet and then make their way into real life. Was that what was going on here with this assassination? Or was it more to do with the prime minister's former policies, whether they be foreign affairs, economic, or something of another sort?
Yes, I think it was very much related to Abe's economics, not so much his political beliefs. But while Abe is known for his foreign policy and national security strategy, he also made some drastic changes in the economy, known as Abenomics. But as part of that, he wanted more competition in the labor force and deregulation. And it is true that while Abenomics did give a boost to the Japanese economy, it also accelerated inequality. And if you didn't have a good education and if you didn't join the right company at the right time, there was a possibility that you couldn't become a full-time employee and you were just a part-time worker. And if you go down that spiral, it's very difficult in Japanese society to start out your career as a part-time worker and then later join a company as a full-fledged full-time worker. The Japanese companies don't hire like that. They like to hire 22-year-olds fresh out of college as a full-time worker and stay with their company for the next 40 years. So people who kind of missed out on that cycle ended up struggling to get through. And I think this guy was also part of that, a whole chunk of people who lost out in the competition. It's understandable that this suspect would have grudges against Abe's economic policy. So I'm sure that it wasn't just this one video that he saw, but he saw Abe as the symbol or the reason of all his struggles. And going back to the internet chatter, unlike America, where there's a heated argument between Republicans and Democrats in public, on the record, in Japan, it's very rare to see public discourse. In the anonymous world of social media, there is very heated arguments and demonization of the opposition. And because it's anonymous, the comments become radicalized. Things written about Shinzo Abe on social media are pretty harsh. People would say that his grandfather, Nobusuke Kishi, was a CIA spy and that Shinzo Abe is a successor of that lineage and he's doing everything on behalf of the US. That kind of chatter, it's very prevalent on social media.
So here in the United States, gun laws are infamously lax and result in a number of gun killings every year. We've had political assassination attempts from a shooter at a congressional baseball game practice that left Steve Scalise and many others severely injured. I remember the Gabby Giffords attempted assassination. I was hoping that you could go into how gun laws are in Japan and whether or not the public reaction has been one of shock, considering that this action was carried out by an individual with a gun.
Yeah, so gun laws in Japan are very, very strict. Not just guns, but knives and swords and axes. If you walk down the street with an axe in your hand, you're automatically arrested. There's a law that prohibits you from carrying weapons in public. The fact that a gun was used in this killing was very shocking. You can tell from the way the security police reacted after there were two shots, two from behind Abe. After the first shot was fired, the security police, surprised, they don't jump onto Abe, bring him down and cover him. They're looking left and right and they're not doing anything. So that kind of tells you how rare it is to expect a gun attack. As for the weapon used, it seems like a handmade weapon with 2 cylinders. The suspect is saying that each cylinder could fire 6 bullets at once. And he probably initially got exposure to weapons when he was briefly a member of the Maritime Self-Defense Force. But also he is saying that he learned how to use gunpowder on YouTube.
It's interesting for American listeners because in the United States, obviously, there's a big domestic debate about gun access. And it tends to be an issue that's very polarized on left-right terms, that the right or the conservative part of the American public are strong supporters of these very liberal gun laws that allow people in the public to access these deadly weapons as easily as possible. And it's interesting comparing that to Japan, where the right-leaning conservative party, the LDP, have been in power for almost the entirety of the post-war period, and we've got these very strict gun laws. Can you speak a little bit to that different dynamic? Is there any kind of domestic debate over gun laws, or is there really just a consensus?
There's an absolute consensus that we don't want guns. Japan is very proud of how safe the streets are. And there is absolutely no faction in Japan calling for weaker gun restrictions. I think every Japanese person is just puzzled that there's such a debate in America. Why would anybody want to have a weapon? If there was a poll, I'm pretty sure that 99% of Japanese people would oppose any easing of restrictions of carrying guns or weapons.
So Ken, this attitude that emphasizes public safety, the expense of the average public citizen's access to weapons of murder, is this a consensus that began in recent decades, in the post-war period, or is this something that goes back further? How deeply rooted is this in the Japanese political culture? What are the origins of this attitude that emphasize safety against the rights of people to kill each other?
I think Japan and every other country in the world would agree that regular people shouldn't carry weapons. Americans should be asking themselves why they have such a debate. But if you really go into history, there was a period in the 16th century where a warlord called Toyotomi Hideyoshi issued a nationwide order to ban everybody from having swords, the samurai swords. So that was taken away. That was like 1580 something. So since then, nobody has had weapons.
The idea of almost everyone around the world outside of the United States having almost a consensus about this, that public safety matters and, people shouldn't walk around in their communities worried that they're going to be killed at any time. I mean, this was certainly the consensus that we had in the UAE as well. And the anomalous case is the United States. And I know, Ken, that even asking that question seems so strange, but, most of our listeners and us, we're here in the US. So it's good to get that perspective when we can.
Ken, for listeners here in the United States, for folks like myself and John who just aren't in Japan to experience the reaction to the longest serving prime minister in recent memory being assassinated, could you get into what type of response there's been from the public in Japan?
Well, it would be like the JFK killing, if there was a comparison. Abe's wife, Akie Abe, in her eulogy, said she feels like it's still a dream, not in a good way, but she can't believe what's happening. And I think that kind of represents what we're all feeling. Nobody really can believe what happened and how quickly we lost Shinzo Abe. If you look at the footage that has come out since the July 8th incident, he was shot and he's on the ground. And basically, that's it. He's not moving. There's no response. He's lying flat on the ground with blood. It went through his heart. So the left side of his chest is covered in blood. He was given emergency treatment on the spot. And then they called a helicopter into the scene and he was taken to a nearby hospital and he was on life support for 5.5 hours. His wife, Akie, came at around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. She held his hand. And then at 5:03 minutes later, he passed away. One of the prominent LDP politicians, Sanae Takaichi, who's the policy chief of the ruling party and an Abe protege, her constituency is in Nara Prefecture, where Abe died. So she has said on Twitter that she was in constant contact with the hospital, and she had been asking the hospital to keep Abe on life support at least until his wife arrives from Tokyo. And she tweeted, and Takaichi tweeted that listening to Akie's eulogy at the funeral, she felt that this request was worthwhile because Akie said in the eulogy that it felt like when she went to Abe and held his hand, that he squeezed her hand back before passing away. A very moving story.
Ken, it's interesting, this comparison to President Kennedy, because obviously the Kennedy assassination was one of the most shocking events in American history. It galvanized the American public in a way that's still remembered more than half a century on. But President Kennedy was someone who was only in office as president for a little more than 2.5 years. And in that sense, he's in some ways a bit of a smaller figure than Abe. Abe was, I believe, the longest serving prime minister of the post-war era and one of the top 3 longest serving in all of Japanese history. He, in some ways, looms larger in Japanese life than President Kennedy even did. I mean, President Kennedy is an icon, but not necessarily someone who had as deep an impact on public policy. Where does Abe fit into the pantheon of Japanese leaders? Do you consider him to be one of the most significant?
Just in comparison to JFK, though, JFK was directly elected as president, whereas we're a parliamentary system, so nobody voted for Shinzo Abe as prime minister. He just happened to lead the party, and people voted for that party, and indirectly he became prime minister. So it's a little bit different.
Well, Ken, what about, we could think then about Winston Churchill or Margaret Thatcher, these figures that come out of parliamentary systems, Angela Merkel, but loom so large in a country's political culture and have such a deep impact on public policy. Is Abe similar in some ways to figures like that? Probably has a deeper legacy than Merkel, at least, who was in office for a long time, but didn't change the country in a fundamental way in Germany.
Right. So you get to a good point, the significance of Shinzo Abe. And the number one significance is that he was in office for a very long time, 7 years and 8 months in his second stint as prime minister, and for 1 year in his first stint, which wasn't as successful. This is important because the US-Japan alliance is the bedrock of Japan's foreign policy. And for the American side, whether the counterpart in Tokyo is a long-serving prime minister or a short-term prime minister is very different. And before Abe, the prime ministers in Japan were changing every single year. So the biggest difference that Abe brought to the table was that he was in office for a very long time. And therefore, that was a reflection of the fact that Shinzo Abe was very strong in elections, and he led the LDP to victory after victory in the general elections, which is the lower house elections, and the upper house elections, and the local elections. He was pretty much unbeatable for most of his tenure. I think he never lost an election. He stepped down at the end due to illness, but it wasn't because he lost an election. So Shinzo Abe, in his second term from 2012 to 2020, he never lost an election. So that creates so much political capital to implement foreign policy and the economy. And if you step back and think of why Shinzo Abe was so popular, why Shinzo Abe became prime minister in the first place, everything goes back to an incident in 2002. September 17th, 2002, then Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi went to North Korea, Pyongyang, for the first time as a Japanese leader. And Shinzo Abe, who was the number 3 in the Prime Minister's office, he was the so-called Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary. He accompanied Junichiro Koizumi to Pyongyang. And what Abe did during that trip cemented his popularity in Japan. And from that year until his death, I think Shinzo Abe was the most popular politician in Japan throughout those 2 decades. So what he did was, when Koizumi went to Pyongyang, before the meeting with Kim Jong-il started, the North Korean side gave the Japanese side a piece of paper regarding what happened to the so-called abductees, the people that North Korea kidnapped from Japan in the 1970s and 80s. The North Koreans until then had never admitted that they had kidnapped these people. They were kidnapped for either to be a translator or interpreter to prepare North Korean spies to go into Japan, or, very skillful artists who were kidnapped to create the counterfeit US dollars that they were counterfeiting in North Korea. But they were kidnapped for various reasons, but the North Koreans had never admitted that. But when Koizumi went to North Korea, in the morning before the meeting started, the North Koreans handed a piece of paper to the Japanese side saying, of the 13 people that you guys have raised as suspected to be kidnapped, 5 are alive, 8 have died. So the Koizumi went into the meeting in a very somber mood and said, in the morning session of the meeting with Kim Jong-il, he said, this kidnapping is unforgivable, and as long as we don't settle this issue, you return everybody and you apologize, we cannot possibly move forward in our relationship. And Kim Jong-il apparently was smiling and didn't say anything about the abductions. And they decided to have a lunch break. And the North Korean side had prepared lunch, but the Japanese side was worried about being poisoned. So they said, no, thank you. They went into a different room and brought the onigiri, the rice balls that they had brought from Tokyo. They ate that. And here Shinzo Abe told Koizumi in a very loud voice, because he knew that the room was being bugged, he said, Mr. Prime Minister, if Kim Jong-il doesn't acknowledge the kidnapping and doesn't apologize officially, then we should just go home. I know we've agreed beforehand to issue a joint statement with the North Koreans, a forward-looking joint statement, but Mr. Prime Minister, you should never sign this document unless Kim Jong-un acknowledges the kidnapping. And the aides were wondering why Abe was speaking in such a loud voice, because they had agreed, because the room is probably bugged, that any discussion among the Japanese side, we should do it on paper. We should write it down and pass the memos between us. But the reason why Abe was doing it so that the North Korean side would understand Japan's position. And so the afternoon session began, and immediately Kim Jong-il said, we acknowledge that we kidnapped Japanese citizens in the 70s and 80s. This was done by elements of the security apparatus who tried to compete to be more brave and more courageous. I did not personally know of these kidnappings, but I apologize, and we will return anybody who is alive to Japan. And then, so Koizumi and Kim Jong-il issued a joint statement, and Koizumi came back with 5 members who were alive. The 8 people who the North Koreans said are still probably alive too. So that's why this issue is still ongoing. But the background of that meeting was later briefed to the public, and that's when Shinzo Abe cemented his popularity.
Well, Ken, I think before we talk any more about Shinzo Abe's legacy, we've been acknowledging his very long tenure in office. And something that's pretty remarkable for outsiders when looking at the Japanese political system is seeing this dominance that the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, which is the conservative party, have had, especially, in the post-war period when they've been in power for almost the entire time. And I would like to hear from you, Ken, an explanation for how that is. Is there anything structural in Japanese politics, or is it just very clever political strategy? How have they managed to essentially control and govern the country as a one-party state practically for such a long period? What's the explanation for that?
Japan has a very unique characteristic, and that's that it lost World War II, and it has completely, as of August 1945, it has moved on to a new path. This trauma of losing World War II is at the core of everything that has happened since then. So what happened after losing World War II was that there became 2 kind of streams of politics. One would be to go alongside the United States. We did sign a security alliance with the US and became an ally. So one path was to always be America's partner, fight for America's liberal democratic values. The other stream was to go the communist path, to side with the Soviets, or be pro-China, or be pro-North Korea. This political wing that tried to entertain the experiment of communism. This gained strong momentum during the Vietnam War days, when the American planes and aircraft carriers and ships were moving to Vietnam from bases in Japan. The fact that Japan was being used as a launching pad for these offensive attacks, for those who are sympathetic to the communist cause, said this is not the new path that Japan chose after World War II. We have renounced war as a means to settle international disputes. We vowed not to have any army whatsoever, any military, any air force, any navy. So why are we taking part in this aggressive war started by the Americans? And that was the main reason for the 1968 student demonstrations that took part all across Japan. That argument ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it no longer made sense to support communism or to pursue socialism. That debate ended. It was like Francis Fukuyama said, in Japan, it was the end of history. There was only one path to go for Japan, and that was the liberal democratic path, side by side with the United States. And the LDP was that party. So all the other opposition parties who are more pro-Soviet, pro-communism, pro-socialism, they're all wiped out.
But Ken, if there is a consensus inside of Japan on the U.S. alliance, if that's by far the most popular path to take, shouldn't the political parties then compete on other matters? I mean, in countries like Germany or the UK or Canada, the main political parties, they don't really dispute things like the NATO alliance. There's a consensus there, and then they debate other topics. Why haven't the opposition done that in Japan so that they can actually be competitive and try to win power? That's the strange thing for me. I don't understand why there isn't the ability of the parties to kind of contort themselves in a necessary way to try to build a plurality or majority support.
Yeah, this is a very interesting point. But more recently, there had been a debate over whether Japan should be pro-China or anti-China, whether to embrace China and try to bring it into the international community, or to deter China, build up, along with the US, a very strong forward-postured structure that would deter China from taking any action. In 2009, when the DPJ, the Democratic Party of Japan, beat out the LDP to come into power for the first time in decades, they advocated a foreign policy that was more embracing of China, that would position Japan at equal distance from the US and Japan and China. And then one of their prominent politicians, Ichiro Ozawa, took over 100 members of parliament to Beijing to shake hands with then President Hu Jintao. And each one of them took a photo with Hu Jintao at the Great Hall of the People. They took it back to their constituencies and used it on posters in elections because they thought that was the cool thing to do. More recently, that kind of argument has died down as well. And there is a broad consensus that China is probably the biggest threat that Japan faces. And therefore, Japan should be united in deterring China. To go back to your question, in 2010, China overtook Japan in terms of GDP and became the second largest economy in the world. Japanese people had a very hard time accepting that. Until then, China was always the emerging economy. Japan was the advanced economy. Japan was the only member of the G7, not the G8. China was not. So people really had trouble accepting that fact. More recently, I think the consensus is that Japan has to have a strong deterrence against China, and Japan needs to increase its defense budget. Japan needs to be competitive. So those opposition parties who are calling, for instance, to cancel the consumption tax or to increase welfare, to give more handouts to the poor, that really doesn't resonate much because the underlying fear is the rise of China and the need to be prepared for that in terms of military budget or in terms of competitiveness, to implement structural reforms that prepares Japan so that it's not dominated by China in the future. That, I think, is the broader consensus. And the opposition parties who are calling for more benefits, just they're not trusted, I think.
It seems like these opposition parties are some of the poorest political strategists anywhere in the developed world, Ken.
Yeah, they keep changing their policies. Some of them initially are pacifists. They were like, we don't want to touch the constitution, the pacifist constitution. Now half of the opposition is saying, yeah, let's change the constitution. So it's very difficult to pinpoint the opposition parties and say what they stand for. Nobody knows. I have no idea what they stand for.
Well, Ken, we're talking about how China has emerged in recent decades as the dominant issue and how to manage the rise of China and the Japanese relationship with China has become so important. So let's pivot back to this discussion about Shinzo Abe's legacy. How did he manage the China question?
Shinzo Abe was very different from any other politician in post-war Japan for two reasons, I think. One, he understood very clearly that the US-Japan alliance was not on equal footing. The Americans had a treaty obligation to come to defend Japan if Japan was attacked. But Japan didn't have any obligation because of Article 9 of the Constitution, which says two things. One, Japan forever renounces war as a means to settle international conflicts. And two, Japan will never maintain a land, air, and sea force, a military. So all the leaders until Abe were using Article 9 to say, well, we'd like to help America, but because of these constitutional constraints, we can't. So Abe saw this as a very unsustainable relationship. And I often compare this to Afghanistan and Ukraine. The way the Japanese were approaching the US-Japan alliance was like the Afghanistan troops. They weren't fighting themselves, but they wanted America to fight for them, which is not a sustainable argument for President Biden. Biden cannot ask the families of the men and women in the United States military to go to Afghanistan and fight when the Afghans aren't even fighting. So that was kind of the situation Japan was in. Now, in Ukraine, when Ukraine is fighting so hard against Russia, then it's much more easier for the rest of the world to assist Ukraine. So I think Abe wanted to show that kind of resolve and determination that Japan was willing to protect itself. So what he did, he first tried to change the constitution, but that was a little too steep. But he didn't give up. So in 2015, he introduced comprehensive national security laws, which changed the interpretation of when Japan could use its self-defense forces. Until then, the laws said that the self-defense forces could only be deployed in the protection of Japan when Japan was directly attacked. So if somebody was shooting missiles at Japan, then the SDF could be deployed. But if America was being attacked in the Taiwan Straits, previously the interpretation of the Constitution was that that is not related directly to the defense of Japan. So the self-defense forces cannot go to help the Americans. The 2015 laws added to the criteria of when the SDF could be deployed. Until then, it was just the defense of Japan. But Abe added the words, when Japan's survival is at risk. And what this means is that because Japan relies its defense on the Americans 100% based on the US-Japan Security Alliance, if the Americans are attacked in the Taiwan Strait, they won't be able to come over to Japan to defend Japan. So that directly affects the survival of Japan. Therefore, if the Americans are attacked by the Chinese in the Taiwan Straits, the self-defense force can go there, fight alongside the Americans, because this is about Japan's survival. So that's what Abe did in 2015. And that was a tremendous change. And that totally changed Japan's relationship with America in terms of the alliance. And that's number one. Sorry for the long answer. Number two, Abe had a very strategic vision of Japan's security. So Japan's worst nightmare is to have a three-front war: China, of course, North Korea, and Russia. And for decades, Japan has been trying to avoid having all three crises at the same time. Abe looked at all those three and decided that Russia was probably the best bet to reduce tensions. So he reached out to Vladimir Putin, met him 27 times when he was in office, under the premise that he was negotiating with Russia to get the 4 islands in the north back. The 4 islands were taken by the Soviet Union in the last week of World War II. So that was the official line. And people in Japan were very upset with Abe reaching out to Putin because nobody believed that Putin would give back any of the islands. But what Abe was really doing was he was reducing the tensions with Russia so he could focus on North Korea and China. And luckily for Abe, because Donald Trump engaged with Kim Jong-un in North Korea, there was no possibility that North Korea would start a war with Japan. So that threat was reduced. So basically, Abe could focus solely on China. And to do that, he decided to team up with the like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific, the US, of course, but also reached out to India, to Australia, to South Korea, to build a kind of a like-minded coalition to stand up to China. And that is the basis of what we now call the free and open Indo-Pacific.
Ken, here in the United States, as many of our listeners do know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a wide-ranging proposed trade deal that President Barack Obama was very interested in, House Republicans at the time were very interested in, died an infamous death here when President Trump began railing against it. Also, Senator Bernie Sanders began railing against it. At the same time, Prime Minister Abe pushed forward with the deal and really was responsible for it being ratified. So I was hoping you could get into both the legacy of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe regarding international trade and TPP, and also what was his overarching vision and strategy for international trade, the economy, for the region, and also with the United States.
I think Abe was a visionary in that he understood that the future of the world, there would be 2 separate supply chains, one of like-minded countries, like the US, Japan, Southeast Asia, India, and that with China. And I think TPP was kind of preparation for that. So the fact that Trump moved out of it really changed the calculus. But in the long-term strategy, I think Abe saw that it's important to have this free trade area with like-minded countries. So he kept on with the idea, and he continued to press Trump to return. And even if you look at Prime Minister Kishida, the current Prime Minister, when he met with Joe Biden at the end of May, I think he said TPP 6 times in the joint press conference. And this was kind of very strange because everybody knows that America is not coming back to the TPP. But for Kishida to stress that really made clear Japan's stance on where Japan is and how Japan wants America to return. The path that Abe has set is in line with what Biden is saying right now, building a supply chain of like-minded countries. The fact that America is not in TPP is not very logical for Abe or for me or for anybody in this region.
So, Ken, you've talked about how Abe was working to build coalitions of like-minded countries. And there's one country in particular that I do want to ask you about because maybe it's an exception to this pattern. Certainly, when the U.S. looks at partners in the Indo-Pacific, we think of the Republic of Korea, South Korea as being a key part of that picture. But the relationship between Korea and Japan did deteriorate quite a bit under Abe's tenure. This is a complicated part of his legacy. Can you speak a little bit to that?
I don't think the deterioration of relations with South Korea was triggered by Abe. In 2015, Abe and Park Geun-hye agreed. This is very important. They agreed. They didn't sign. There was no official document. That's the cause. That's the reason of all this trouble. But Abe and Park Geun-hye agreed to settle the so-called comfort woman issue. Abe publicly apologized, and the South Koreans agreed that this is it. This is the settlement of this issue. So they came up with a scheme where a fund would be set up, an independent fund would be set up that would compensate the victims, the women who were forced to work in these brothels on behalf of the Japanese Imperial Army. And the Japanese would indirectly offer money to this fund. So it wouldn't be the Japanese government directly compensating, but the money would come from Japan. Then Park Geun-hye fell from power, and then somebody else came, and then that was the agreement was torn up. That wasn't Abe's fault. So the history has been a sticking point between Japan and South Korea, and yes, Abe has gone to the Yasukuni Shrine many times in his career, and it's not like that he was making so much of an effort to reach out to the South Koreans compared to previous prime ministers like Prime Minister Obuchi, who was very sincere in his position towards South Korea. That is true. But in terms of the recent deterioration of relations, I think everybody in Japan thinks that it stems from the regime change in South Korea and how the Moon government tried to revisit the comfort woman issue, which the Japanese government and the South Korean government agreed was over with. The tricky part is that, like I said, the South Koreans and Japanese didn't sign a joint document putting this in paper because of the backlash that was expected on both sides. So it was a gentleman's agreement. That's the context. But there is a new president in South Korea who is committed to engaging with the Indo-Pacific, to strengthen ties with America, and very keen to strengthen ties with Japan as well. And Japan very much welcomes the rise of Yoon Suk-yeol, but is also fearful that years later, when the next president comes, then any agreement would be ripped again. Japan is trying to be very cautious. At the NATO summit in Madrid, when both Moon and Kishida attended, the South Korean side wanted a bilateral meeting with the Japanese, but the Japanese tried all it could to avoid a one-on-one. So they had a trilateral with Biden, and they had a four-way meeting with Australia and New Zealand. So Japan is trying to gradually rebuild ties with South Korea based on facts on the ground and not just words.
I think that you've identified something that's pretty important there, and that's that despite the various perspectives on the controversies about Korea and Japan, certainly the strength of relations are much more determined by the political situation on the Korean side, because there is this kind of whiplash between the different parties that end up in power. Whereas we do have this continuity on the Japanese side. We've been talking about how the LDP really have such a strong grasp of the political landscape in Japan. And in some ways, that's a little bit mirrored with the U.S. relationship, isn't it? Maybe the U.S. is a little bit more like Korea, where we've got two very competitive parties, and there's a lot of going back and forth in foreign policy matters, depending on who's in power. So I suppose that Japan has to try to predict or prepare for the inevitability of change, not only in the Korean relationship, but also in the American one, right?
Yeah, but China has made our jobs so much easier because Xi Jinping keeps going down the path that brings America closer to Japan. So for the longest time, the Japanese were very comfortable with Republicans in the White House, like Reagan, Bush father, Bush Jr., especially in the George W. Bush years when the neocons had the power. The neocons tend to see the world in black and white, and they take care of their allies. So it's very easy. And Japan was always worried when Democrats were in the White House, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, because Democrats, represented by John Kerry, they have a tendency to try to reach out to China too much. When Clinton was in power, he came to Asia. All American presidents come to Japan first, then they go to South Korea, and then they go to China. But very symbolically of the new era, Bill Clinton went to China first and didn't stop by Japan. He was trying to project that China was the future. And the Democrats tend to do this. And Japan was always very uncomfortable until Biden, because Biden has clearly said that Japan and Australia and India, the Quad, is basically on our side and China is on the other side. So that's not so much what Japan has done, but what Xi Jinping has done, like supporting Russia in the Ukraine war. To answer your question, yes, Japan has always tried to manage relations whoever is in the White House, but that task has become so much easier under Xi Jinping.